name is Binur Ercem. I'm the director of the Commonwealth Honors Program there. And I have a tiny speech prepared, so I'm going to read it, and then we will have our speaker introduced. So at the Commonwealth Honors Program here at Middlesex Community College, we are dedicated to fostering intellectual growth within our community by exploring the events, forces, and ideas that shape our world and impact our lives. As part of this mission, we organize scholarly talks to provide academic, unbiased insights that deepen our understanding of today's complex issues. Today's talk offers a thoughtful exploration of key moments in history of the Middle East, paired with an in-depth analysis of the current war. It aims to move beyond surface-level narratives and explore the complex factors that have shaped this region. In an era where misinformation often overshadows academic evidence, this discussion seeks to provide well-researched, fact-based analysis. Commonwealth Honors Program remains committed to bringing distinguished scholars to our campus to share the latest academically grounded perspectives on pressing global issues. We are honored to welcome Professor David Kalivas, whose expertise will guide us on this learning journey. Now, I would like to invite our Associate Provost of Academic Affairs and Strategic Innovations, Matthew Olson, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Binur. Dr. David Kalivas is a retired historian and educator whose career spans many centuries. I'm sorry, no, between the last one and this one. David has made a profound impact on the college and on the community during his tenure at Middlesex Community College, which was
Just 39 years.
39 years. He's Professor Emeritus, and I'm proud to call him my friend. David specializes in global history and interdisciplinary studies. He played a pivotal role shaping our Commonwealth Honors Program that Binur has carried forward as she moved into the director role. David encouraged students as the Commonwealth Honors Director to pursue academic excellence and intellectual curiosity, and his career spans decades of teaching, mentorship, and research with a focus on world civilizations, globalizations, and connections between historical events and modern issues. Known for his dynamic teaching style, Kalivas continues to be well respected for his dedication to student success and lifelong learning. Thank you, David, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I have to say, it's wonderful to be here. I retired 4 years ago, so just on a personal note, I'm delighted to be back in this room, in this building, on this campus, and with colleagues and friends. And with all of you here today, students and staff, and all that are online in the magical world of the internet and Zoom. I call it magical because if you brought someone here from the 2nd century BC, of course you just put on the lights, they'd have a heart attack, right? So, it's rather magical. So today we're going to analyze the Middle East within its historical context. And I should say to you all that the topic we're about to engage today is historical, is one that probes the historical context of a region of the world that is a hotspot in so many ways. But it's not simply historical. It's looking at history and how it informs the present, and how history is used by principles in the present in terms of policy making, in terms of peace settlements, lack of peace settlements. So we are going to be looking at the history, but also the present that is informed by history. So I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. It may not be a comfortable lecture. It may be disturbing at times, but education, if it never disturbs us and never makes us a little uncomfortable, then we're probably not thinking, okay? It is just the way. We need to engage the world, and oftentimes, oh, slide's not working. It was. Oh, now working. oftentimes, and I just want to spend some time, we lose the importance of context. So I want to just spend a little bit about the importance of context. So conflicts, for instance, wars, conflicts, whatever is happening in society never happens in a vacuum. It doesn't just sprout up and it's a problem or a conflict or an issue, and it has no influences from anything else. It's just all by itself. It's complex. And we really have to understand that things are complicated. Situations, wars, conflicts, things in our own society are always complicated. And history will provide us with a wide-angle view. So when thinking about the Middle East, we are going to today get a wide-angle view. We're going to, go over thousands of years quickly, and then, as quick as I can. And then we're going to get to the 20th century, which for me is recent, but to the 20th century and look at what was happening in the 20th century with the Middle East and how it informs the Palestinian-Israeli war or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so we're going to look to really understand the history of the region in this broad brushstroke to introduce you to the multiple layers that we have. And I think it's important for us to realize, as we're getting this wide-angle view with multiple layers, we need to be empathetic, which means we need empathy. In any analysis we do that involves human beings and human society, I don't know in any other society that we'd be talking about that's usually human, but we need to realize we need to be empathetic. Empathy. We need to put ourselves into the shoes of the people that we are studying, that we are analyzing. We can't just be afar and say, oh, I know what's going on, yet never put our shoes into what's going on. Never try and feel, even if we don't agree with it. Never try and feel what others are feeling means we're never going to understand what others are going through and how the others oftentimes are us. And so we need empathy. Keep that in mind. So we need to peel away layers of perceptions. There are many vantage points. We often hear, oh, there are two sides to the story. Oh my goodness, if it were only that simple. There are usually multiple sides. If we only see two sides, we're not analyzing, we're not probing, we're not going beneath the surface. We're not looking at societies and cultures and how they construct reality and how they create ideas about conflicts and wars. There are always multiple vantage points. And there is a clicker. Can I just tell you there we go. So today I'm going to do the history of the Middle East in 45 minutes. Actually, we're locking the doors, we're calling out for pizza and everything else. We'll be here until at least 9 o'clock tonight, and I'll meet back at 8 tomorrow morning. But in all seriousness, it's a tall order. We're going to look at the cultural and the ethnic diversities of the regions, the many regional influences on the region itself, and how ancient the history is in looking at the multiple sides of the conflicts in that region. I thought we'd start with just a little geographical context. So this is, of course, a nighttime satellite view of the Middle East, and no boundaries. Keep that. We often, we look at the maps. No boundaries here. Whatever the boundaries are, whatever the cultures are, whatever the religions are, whatever the territorial disputes are, they are created by the peoples who live there over time. They don't just appear. But when you look, there are no dividers, are there? Interesting. So this is the Middle East. I thought we'd have a little geography. We're going to go around the world. I'll put up a map that has no names, and I'll quiz you. No, I'm kidding. This image of the Middle East, Egypt, Jordan, Israel, the Palestinian territory, Syria, Iraq, etc., Saudi Arabia, all of these countries are not ancient. So I want to start with that. Keep that in mind. These countries are not ancient. They are a manifestation of the international politics of the 20th century. And we will examine how that is so as we move along. Are the peoples and the cultures, do they have an ancient lineage? Yes. But the construction of these countries absolutely does not. And we will look at how they are created in the 20th century and how the 20th century sets and creates the seeds for the conflicts we're looking at today. So, the Middle East is complex, and we could go through this whole list from Syria to Saudi Arabia, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, you can take a glance here, but we don't have the time, obviously, to do all of this. But as you can see, from Syria to Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Lebanon, the role of Turkey, the Yemeni civil war, the Gulf states and their tightrope of investments in global politics, and all the sectarian divides throughout the region. There's a lot to examine. No time to cover it all, so we're going to focus on the Israeli-Palestinian war. And I say the Israeli-Palestinian war. We often hear of it as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, it is a conflict, but it is an ongoing war. Anything with tens of thousands of people dying, anything with millions being dispossessed of their land, anything like that is a war. It's been going on for 100 years in one way or another. And we're going to examine that today. But just to begin with a little comment, the recent escalations that have brought this again into the news. October 7th, Hamas from Gaza attacks the Israeli settlements, approximately 1,200 dead, 200 plus hostages, approximately 97 hostages remaining, probably 65 or so still alive, the other 30 or so are dead. That sets off the Gaza war with the Israelis invading Gaza. Okay, a war of retribution, a war of revenge. Of course, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, at some point will be toothless and blind. So that becomes problematic over time. When will the hate stop? When will the violence stop? But let's try and examine this more closely. The war on Gaza, again, roughly 1,200 Israelis were killed. At this point in time, approximately 43 plus thousand Gazans have been killed. The infrastructure, the society has been devastated by this war. At least 100,000 injured. So, and as you look at this and these numbers, and you can see, in the war, the injured, 87 plus 100 for the Israelis injured. The occupied West Bank, this number has changed. Almost 3,000 killed in the West Bank alone. It's not part of Gaza, but that's because of Israeli settlers essentially having conflicts with the Palestinian communities and with the Israeli army in their search for terrorists, quote unquote, blowing up whole villages and houses. And that's something you should look into more carefully. The carnage has been significant. So calling it a war is the best thing. Could you click for me?
Yes, sorry. Is that it?
There we go. Oops. So here, from another source, Statista, more sources, Israeli dead 1,200, injured 5,400. This is as of October 15th. Israeli soldiers in Gaza, 2,300, 353 killed. Gaza itself, this figure is 42,344. So over 42,000 dead, 99 to 100,000 wounded, including the Palestinians in the West Bank, with 5,500, according to this, dead, 719 injured. So this war has now, I'll just say click, I think. Click. Has now expanded into Lebanon, with a death toll as of November 3rd, over 3,000. It worked that time. The Gaza war, of course, is the longest war since 1948 in this region. It has been going on since October 23. Is it a defensive war for Israel? or is it a struggle for Palestinian existence as a nation? This is something we need to keep in mind as we move forward. Because at some point, it is a struggle for the survival of the Palestinian people. With that level of carnage, more people have been killed than were killed in the Hamas attack. And no one justifies the Hamas attack. It was a horrible attack. Does what has happened balance the scales? I would argue, well, no, it doesn't. What is the solution? I don't have the $100 million answer. But this war is a devastating result of policies of the Israeli government that we're not examining right now in today's lecture, but that you as citizens need to examine and beyond the rhetoric. And one thing is clearly the case. Gaza is being destroyed, and the Gazans, the Palestinians, are being wiped out in large numbers. So this is something to think about. We are now going to try and probe a little bit. What brought us to this point? Really, what brought us to this point? Why did Hamas do what they did? What sense did it make? Most of the Hamas leadership that ordered the killings and the kidnappings on October 7th have been killed now. 43,000 Gazans have been killed, nearly 100,000 injured, infrastructure destroyed, homes destroyed. What brought us to this point? So we need to probe a little bit. And when we think of the Israeli and the Palestinian conflict, is it a religious conflict between, let's say, Judaism and Islam? No, absolutely not. It is not at all. It is a conflict over territory. It is a conflict over competing nationalisms. Zionism, the Israeli nationalism rooted in Zionism from the late 19th century Jewish thinker, Theodor Herzl, who is the father of Israeli nationalism called Zionism. Palestinian national identity also emerges in the late 19th, early 20th century as a distinct identity within Palestine. And they are competing nationalisms, you could argue. And they are struggling, you could argue, over the same territory. All right, keep that in mind. The disputes are over historic lands, we could argue. Over who has the right to settle there, who has the right to return there. What are the solutions? We'll see. But first, some historical context. And a little water. Some historical context. The region has cultural continuity without us even realizing it. When we think of our world today, that in the United States, in the West, when we think of what we think of as Western civilization, for many of you, this little picture is lost, perhaps. But for some of you, this is Charlton Heston as Moses from the Ten Commandments. Like I said, for many of you, the reference fails. But it's a good image of Charlton Heston as Moses with the Ten Commandments, representing, of course, ancient Judaism, right? And when we think of the Judeo-Christian, because Christianity comes out of Judaism, the Judeo-Christian tradition, we think of it as something rooted in the Middle East. Well, it is, obviously. But what we don't realize is going all the way back to the ancient Egyptians with their notions of justice and their notions of eternal life and their notions of the eternal judgment, all of which influences the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition. So if we look at the Zoroastrian, the Islamic tradition, the Judeo tradition, the Christian tradition, they're all linked. All these holy books share common motifs from a historical perspective, share common cultures. And we don't often think of it. So we don't think of it as the Egyptian, this would be a mouthful, Of course, it's easy to say the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. But really, what we should be saying is the Egyptian, Judeo-Zoroastrian, Christian, Islamic tradition. That is the foundations of what we think of as Western civilization. It's a little more complicated, isn't it? What is all that stuff that I just said? Well, we don't have time to examine it, but if you took my world cultures class, I don't teach anymore because I'm retired, we would analyze some of it. You remember? Yes, one of my former victims in class. So, we need to realize that when we look at the region, going all the way, this is where modern Israel is today in the Palestinian territories, and of course you can see it. Going all the way back to Pharaonic Egypt, if we go back, we will realize that yes, were there kingdoms of Israel? So there was a kingdom of Israel in the north, a kingdom of Judah in the south. The biblical version says there was a united kingdom of Israel under Saul, and then David, and David's son Solomon. And then after Solomon, it broke up into the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. For a short time then, there was a united kingdom of Israel according to the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, the Torah, and the entire Talmudic tradition. There was this, that is the biblical interpretation, the biblical tradition. There's no historical evidence, however, for a united kingdom of Israel. None. There are some inscriptions that talk there are 3 stone inscriptions that refer to a house of David and refer to a nation, a people of Israel, but nothing about a united kingdom. There is no archaeological evidence. There's no evidence of a temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem that we see today that goes back to the age of Herod, to the Roman period, if you would, and the Jewish king Herod. That's where that temple goes back to. And so what we need to realize, and the reason I'm raising it, of course, is that by the 8th century, 9th and 8th centuries, these kingdoms of Israel and Judah that existed were swallowed up by the Assyrians and swallowed up by the Babylonians during the whole Babylonian captivity, that then Cyrus the Great from Persia releases them. It's during that time that a lot of the biblical traditions are written over hundreds of years. And the reason I'm raising it is that today, the Zionists, the Israeli nationalists, during the different peace negotiations, as we'll see, will always make claims to Judea and Samaria, this region, as being the time of a united Israel, of a united people with historic claims. The reality is, there are no historic claims that are legitimate in history, only in the biblical tradition. Then that's an important element to keep in mind, because that has been the justification. It's as if we're going for continued Israeli settlements in the West Bank over the past 40 years. And as we'll see, that creates complications. So it's important to look at the history of the region. And when we do, what we'll realize is that the historical claims are not historical. They're based in nationalist beliefs. In this case, Israeli nationalist beliefs, Zionism. And the other reality that we have to think about is that's, I suppose, the Roman Empire moved its capital to Constantinople, current-day Istanbul, and was there for 1,000 years. Does that mean that the Greeks and the Italians, who were the precursors to who were the Roman emperors, they should go back and tell Turkey, we want our country back. You're on our country? No. Or the Native Americans were all here before us. So keep this in mind about how we use history or abuse it. And of course, look at the region. For several thousand years, we have the Persian Empire, we have Alexander's empire and Hellenic imperialism. That deserves much longer topic, but we don't have time. We have the Ptolemaic Empire, that is the empire that covers this whole region from Egypt out. That's a general of Alexander. The last Ptolemy was Cleopatra. And so the Macedonians, the Greeks to the north of Greece, occupied for over 4 centuries. Does that mean the Macedonians have a right to go back? I don't think so. And then we have, of course, the Roman Empire. Look at all of the empires here, the religions that emerge out of the region, the origins of Islam and its expansion into the region, the Islamic Caliphate, and then eventually the Crusader states. When you have the conflict in the Middle Ages, the Crusader states established Latin kingdoms in the kingdom of Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, Edessa, for 192 years, 200 years. Do they have a right to return and claim the territory as their own? Yeah, not happening, right? Of course not. And of course, the Ottoman Empire, from 1301 to 1922, it was controlled, the entire region, including North Africa, by the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So there has not been any one group of people that have been there for the longest time. And then, of course, how am I doing for time?
1 p.m. exactly right now.
Oh, I'll move it along. And then, of course, by 1900, I'm jumping ahead. Who's the empire that's dominant? The British Empire. And the British Empire is dominant in the region and the world at that time. Now, mind you, at that point, beginning in 1908, at that point, oil was discovered. And of course, the Suez Canal had always been a strategic reason for empires to control Egypt for international trade. But oil emerges in 1908, and then of course, navies, the British Navy shifts to oil away from coal. The navies of the global empire shift away from coal to oil. Oil becomes important, as you know. And if it had been broccoli, I like to put that up there. If broccoli had been the major strategic interest in the Middle East, if that's all they had, no oil, we wouldn't be having this lecture. There'd be no reason because no one would care much. There'd be a little outpost. It'd be a whole different world, wouldn't it? But oil, it is. In 1914, this map shows you, I drew a red circle as best I could around the region. But this map shows you, the British, the French, the Italians, the Turkish, the Spanish, the great power interests and the great power territories in this region. And if you notice, the British very much, even though nominally this is part of the Ottoman Empire, de jure, by law, if you would legally, it's part of the Ottoman Empire, yet in fact, the British by the 1880s are in firm control of these areas. 1914, World War I breaks out. It's what happens after World War I that creates the Middle East as we think of it today, and creates many of the problems as we think of it today, and certainly sets the seeds for the Israeli-Palestinian war and conflict. So let's stop a moment. Are there any little questions right now? I've covered a lot. I was saying we could wait till the end, but do you have any questions for this section so far? Yes?
So, you mentioned that there's no non-biblical evidence.
There's several stone inscriptions.
Okay. Could it be possible that it was destroyed by the Babylonians or the Assyrians?
So it could be very possible that things were destroyed, but there's also no archaeological evidence of a capital city to speak of, and there's no records in any of the Egyptian archives, in any of the diplomatic archives of a kingdom, or any of the archives of the other kingdoms in the region. There, like I said, references to House of David, so there absolutely was a House of David. There's references to a kingdom, but not a united one. And then there's no diplomatic back and forth. At this point, and so that's the problem with that.
Yeah.
There needs to be some evidence, particularly the Egyptians at that time, while it was, I think, the third intermediate period. Anyway, don't hold me to it was one of those intermediate periods in the 3,000-year Egyptian history. it was, they had their decentralized moments. They weren't as strong as they had been, but they still had diplomatic relations. They still would have dynastic marriages with other kingdoms. Nothing ever comes up. So at this point, it's biblical, and it's like Exodus. Not to open up a can of worms, but Exodus, there's no historical evidence for Exodus. It's a biblical story. It's part of the nationalist, if you would, foundation for Israeli nationalism that comes out of the Old Testament. And it's a big debate with historians, but there's no support that says, for instance, that Pharaoh's army chased the enslaved Jews out of Egypt. If Pharaoh's army had been defeated by the wall of fire, someone would have mentioned it. Really. It would have been a big thing. Wall of fire emerges, army swallowed up. No mention. So those are biblical. And that's hard for us sometimes to wrap our arms around because we're so used to it being part of our cultural context because it is. But it's not historical. Okay. All right, we'll move. 1916. The World War I is going on. The British want allies in the Middle East to fight the Ottoman Turks because the Ottoman Turks had allied with Kaiser's Germany, right? They were allied with the Kaiser's Germany and Austria, and so the British were fighting the Ottoman Turkish armies in the Middle East. And you can see by that map earlier, they were right there. They had an interest in the Suez Canal, and as we would see, they had an interest in oil production. And so the British would say, well, look, we need to make allies with the Arabs. And at this point, the Arabs of Arabia and the Arabs of Palestine, the Arabs of Iraq, the Arabs of Lebanon, they're all Arabs. All of these different dividers had not emerged as nation states. And they were all Arabs within different contexts. There were the Bedouin Arabs, the Arabs of Palestine, the Arabs of Arabia, the Arabs of the Hijaz, the Arabs of the Negev Desert. So yes, there were distinctions, but no nation states. And so the British say, well, we need to organize with the Arabs against the Turks. So let's send our people in. So the most famous one is T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. You all heard of Lawrence of Arabia? Who has not heard of Lawrence of Arabia? Oh, a couple. Okay. I guess I need to come teach a Middle East class. No, but seriously, Lawrence of Arabia, look him up. Fascinating character, I say no more. And he was played very well by Peter O'Toole in the movie of Lawrence of Arabia. So this right here, that's Peter O'Toole. So I used the picture from the movie to simulate what was the attack on Aqaba that really happened. But I had all these black and white photos, and of course nobody was filming the attack on Aqaba when he did it, so that's a good one, when they took a Turkish port in the Red Sea. But other than that, this is T.E. Lawrence here in Arab dress. Here he is here with Prince Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein, and his father. And the Sharif of Mecca was the protector of the holy sites of Islam in Mecca and Medina, and whose family line is the Hashemites. And the Hashemites, they are the kings of Jordan today. That's where the kings of Jordan come from. And the Hashemites trace their line all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. And all the way back. And so he was a major force, Hussein. Now Hussein in Arabia, in Western Arabia, and he had correspondence with the British Commissioner McMahon. In this correspondence, and it's all there to read, the British promise, if the Arabs revolt against the Turks, that they would give the Arabs a kingdom of all of Arabia. When you need something, promise everything. Lie later, right? So they promised everything. I'm giving you the short version. T.E. Lawrence helped organize with the Arabs the revolt. They took the major Turkish port of Aqaba in the Red Sea. They marched all the way to Damascus, Syria. They took Damascus and this major revolt, and then along the way, they blew up trains all the time. disrupting Turkish supply routes, and being a general thorn in the side to the Ottoman Turks, while the British army then moves into Jerusalem. Short story, right? So, British promises. This is Prince Faisal again. He eventually becomes king of Iraq. Well, that's later. There he is here. Here's Lawrence of Arabia, still with his headdress, at Versailles. And here we are. There will be a new Hashemite kingdom of Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq, what we think of today. Well, at the same time, the British are having a secret treaty with the French called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And in this one, they say to the French and the British, they say, oh, secret now, no one must know, because we just promised the Arabs the store. We're going to divide up the Middle East into our spheres of influence, the British and the French. The Russians were initially part of this deal. The Russians were going to be given Constantinople, Istanbul today. And the Italians were going to get a part. But the Russians, of course, had the Russian Revolution. They left the war, and so the Russians were left out. The British and the French were going to divide it all up. Click. Oh, there we go, I got it now. They were going to divide it all up. All right, 1917, let's keep this in mind. The war's not over yet. Doesn't get over until 1918. In 1917, something called the Balfour Declaration. Let that sink in. We would never even think of the Balfour Declaration had events not unfolded as they did. That's it behind me. 1917, I circled it in red for all the blood that will follow. And essentially, in 1917, the British promised the representatives of the World Zionist Organization, through Lord Rothschild, that they would create a process to allow the migration of European and worldwide Jews into Palestine, and would do all they could to create a national homeland for the Jews. Let's read it. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, King of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Boy, what's wrong with this is that the population of Palestine, which had been an identity of Palestine going back to the ancient Roman era, let's look at let's look at right here for purposes of time. In 1882, 5% of the population were Jews, and 95% Arabs and Christians, and a few others. In 1914, that begins to change, 10%. However, in the 30s, and of course the scourge of the Nazis and fascists, and Hitler, and the threats to the Jewish population, and the British control allowing increase, by 1948, the population of Jews in Palestine was 33%. But that migration occurred not since ancient times, and this is the point. When history is abused and said, oh, it's our ancient lands, we've been there since. No, that's just not true. The migration took place in these years. Now, after, of course, the war in 1921, there's another conference. Here's Churchill somewhere. Churchill's right here, Gertrude Stein, and of course, I think Lawrence of Arabia. Again, establishing the boundaries for the Middle East. The British get this area here, Jordan and Palestine, called the British Mandate. Jerusalem was going to be an international city, neither for the Jews nor for the Arabs of Palestine. British influence clear. Iraq was created, Saudi Arabia created, but instead of giving it to the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein, and his family, who had instituted and instigated and organized the Arab revolt, they gave it to the House of Saud, hence Saudi Arabia, not the Hashemite Kingdom of Arabia. And essentially, the Hashemites went packing over and they got Jordan. Well, no oil in Jordan. The holy sites not in Jordan. And this was given, the British decided that the House of Saud, that followed the Wahhabists, a very conservative, ultra-Orthodox, fundamentalist we would call it, and there's complications with that word, Islamic tradition, they gave it to the House of Saud and in Saudi Arabia till this day. By 1936, how are we doing?
You're 115, slide 44.
All right, I better move along. So, by 1936, of course, remember this document. Oh. Where are we? Nothing to be done which would prejudice the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities of Palestine. 90% of the population, 95%, were Arabs of Palestine. Couldn't they have said the Arabs of Palestine? Or the Arabs? Or the Palestinians as the identity begins? No, they didn't. Did they? And by 1930, whoops, where'd I go? By 1936, these non-Jewish communities, as the Balfour Declaration was referred to, the Arabs of Palestine had had enough of being dispossessed of property. They had enough of migration coming in, displacing, and they revolted in 1936. The British crushed the revolt militarily, and of course, then there's a commission, a royal commission put in place. The Peel Commission comes up with this partition, that essentially this would be the blue area of the Jewish state, Jerusalem would be part of the British Mandate area, all this area, and all the green would be annexed to Jordan. Well, neither the Arabs of Palestine nor the Jews found this acceptable. Then in 1947, after the war, World War II, the UN comes up with a partition plan. Again, this would be the Arab state, this would be the Jewish state, and Jerusalem would be international. Both sides found it unacceptable. But then, in 1948, this is David Ben-Gurion, the founder and the first president of the Israeli state. And this is a picture of Theodore Herzl, who founded the Zionist movement. After World War II, 1948, the Israelis declared their independence unilaterally. And for the Palestinians, for the Arabs of Palestine, Israeli independence for the Israelis, finally, it is a tremendous celebration, creation of Israeli state, especially after the Holocaust, a place for the Jews of Europe and worldwide diaspora to come to, a time to celebrate. For the roughly 740,000 Arabs of Palestine that were dispossessed of their homes in the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, it was the Nakba, the Great Catastrophe. Joyous independence for one, for 750,000, the Great Catastrophe. That 700,000+ people today roughly is 7 million Palestinians, approximately 5 million living in West Bank and Gaza, the occupied territories. So clearly, the Israeli independence, what happens? The Arab states invade, trying to crush it, they fail. and we don't have obviously the time, but I'm trying to introduce you. That's the first war in 1948. For the first time, there is an independent state. The flag of the Zionist organization, of course, that is established in 1897, becomes the flag of Israel. And this, of course, the flag of the Arabs of 1917, the Palestinian flag, continues, of course, to be the flag of the Palestinians. Since 1948, what has happened? Here is the West Bank and Gaza. This is the Golan Heights. This was occupied by the Israelis in the Six-Day War in 1967, and they continued to occupy it because Israel does not have a peace treaty with Syria. However, peace treaties were eventually established with Egypt and with Jordan. And if we look at a timeline of events, we should just keep this in mind, that there's, the 1948 war, the 67 war, there are these things called the intifadas, the uprisings in the occupied territories by the Palestinians against Israeli military rule. There are the Yom Kippur War of 73, but since then, since 73, the Israeli state has been at peace with the two major participants in the early wars, Jordan and Egypt. Egypt got back the Sinai Desert. Jordan got some territories. However, the Palestinians have never had a resolution. And the Palestinians argue for a right to live within their own sovereign state. That has not happened. In 1978, there's the Camp David Accords. Carter, Sadat of Egypt, Menachem Begin of Israel. That establishes a process that gives a process of peace for Egypt and Jordan, not for the Palestinians. Sadat is murdered within 2 years for his actions at this time. Menachem Begin says that we will never give up the rights of Judea and Samaria. We will never give up our right to the holy ancient lands that are ours, that I pointed out that have been many peoples over the centuries and thousands of years. And those lands are in the West Bank. And we will never give it up. And so since these 78 Accords, and then of course, in 1993, the Oslo Accords, that was the signing ceremony in Washington. Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat of the PLO, Yitzhak Rabin of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, the other leader, signed the direct final negotiations with the representatives of the Palestinians, the PLO. And within 2 years, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by Israeli extremist fundamentalists who do not want peace with the Palestinians at any cost. And what happens here is that even though we have these accords, and Yasser Arafat says at one point, I cannot go home with anything less than the West Bank and Gaza. And so these settlements have to go. Because he said, I too can be assassinated. Because the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, are not united. Hence, Hamas had Gaza and the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, had West Bank. And what happens, he says, the Palestinians argue, well, since we had the peace agreements, this is West Bank. You see all these green dots? Those are all the settlements. So if we're going to have a state, if the Israelis are serious about having a state, but at the same time, as Menachem Begin and every prime minister since has said, these are our historic holy lands of Judea and Samaria. And in fact, the current nominee to be ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Israel, has said there are no Palestinians, there is no West Bank, there is only Judea and Samaria. That should frighten all of you. Because that is his nationalist beliefs, not historic reality. And what happened, nor is it reality on the ground. If you look at this right here, This is Palestine in 1897, over the years, 1946. The green areas, of course, 1948, this becomes the state of Israel. No. So, but there we have in the present, roughly. This is what is left. When Arafat was negotiating with Rabin in the 90s, we're looking at this area of West Bank. This is because of all the settlements, because of the wall that has been built by the Israelis, because of all the military checkpoints of the Israelis against the Palestinians, because of all the roughly hundreds and hundreds of settlements. This is all that's left. So is there, we think of the Gaza war, but we think of the ongoing conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, despite all the peace, and we often hear talks about the roadmap to peace. How can there be a roadmap to peace? How can there be 2 states, 1 state? What state? When there's no territory for a Palestinian state. When the settlements remain. And it's not as if there isn't a precedent. When the Israelis gave up the Sinai for the peace with Egypt, they gave up all the settlements and territories in the Sinai. So if it is land for peace, then that's what has to be. But no one is even talking about that anymore. And primarily because no one's creative. There's no honest broker. The U.S. is not seen as an honest broker for peace anymore. And do we have hope? Well, maybe there's some hope. If you look at Yitzhak Rabin, the former prime minister who was assassinated by the Israeli extremists for his role in the peace, he says to us from the grave, we must think differently, look at things in a different way. Peace requires a world of new concepts, new definitions, not eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc. And Mahmoud Abbas, the 89-year-old president of the Palestinian Authority, and by the way, the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian government in the West Bank today has lost confidence because of the Gaza war, and at 89 he should probably consider retirement. I was much younger when I considered it. And but it is a real crisis now amongst the Palestinians also about who will lead them. But he has said, we do not want to miss an opportunity to bring about peace. It is time for the Palestinian people to gain their freedom and independence. But these ring hollow when you have military checkpoints, when you have an ongoing war with 43,000 dead, that has now escalated to Lebanon with over 3,000 dead, and now becoming more regional with Iran. And with the lobbying back and forth of missiles, and we don't know the next steps. So I say to you that if you want to think about, if you want to think about peace, we need to think creatively. This is the map of the United States before it was the United States. At that time, the Native Americans lost, didn't they? We're not in the 18th century or the 16th century, or the 17th century anymore. It's the 21st century. We need to think creatively about peace and realize who the principals are and what their needs are, and not just satisfy the needs of one without even looking at the needs of others, because even though the nominee for the Israeli ambassador says there is no West Bank, there is no Palestine, he's wrong. There is. And until that's recognized, this conflict and war will continue, and the devastation will continue, and the insecurity will continue. Something to think about. Thank you. So, do we have time for questions?
Sure.
Either from the Zoom audience or this audience, right?
Well, you wanna-
So, but here, first, we just covered a lot, and I'm exhausted, but I'm ready to go. So let's have some questions. We can stay for another hour, too. He says, oh no, please. No, not that. Okay, questions? Comments? Yes, please.
So what is the role of the U.S. military support? It gives Israel weapons, correct?
So, yeah, the U.S. is a supply, we supply weapons and aid to Israel. And there's a real issue. And let me just say, the Netanyahu government actually had agreed with Hamas several years back, in 2018 I think it was, and had agreed with Hamas and let Qatar, or Qatar as we all say in the West, but Qatar, provide millions of dollars and weapons to Hamas. And so there's a lot, weapons are just flowing into the region and from all parties. And it does raise a real issue though, that if there is going to be peace, maybe stop supplying everybody with weapons, huh? That could be creative. I mean, I guess it takes a little, creativity to think, oh, they're killing each other with the weapons we give them. Maybe don't give them the weapons. But no one's forcing them. And then in US politics, if you say we're not going to supply aid to Israel, go ahead, run for office, see how that goes for you. Seriously, it's a real issue. Because we don't want to be truthful about what Zionism is as a nationalist identity and what it means, and we don't want to be truthful that Judea and Samaria, sure, let's go back 3,000 years. But there was also the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire. I mean, does that mean you dispossess the people that are there and you push them out? And then one of the problems that's emerging is that we haven't heard, and we don't hear enough here, unless you read other news sources, is that the West Bank, the reason there are over 5,000 deaths in the West Bank, even though it's the war in Gaza, is because the Israeli military has stood by while Israeli settlers go into communities like Jenin in the West Bank and a Bedouin community as well, just recently, and they broke into the schools, they break into homes, and they blow them up in the quote-unquote the search for terrorists where none were, as a means to harass the Palestinians. And we don't like to say this, but the charter of some of these communities are all about pushing out the Palestinians. And the more settlements you have, the more uncomfortable it becomes for Palestinians in these regions, the better it will be to never have a two-state solution from the Israeli vantage point.
David, from online, what about the Abraham Accords? Anything to them?
Yeah, what did they
Can you
do?
repeat that, please?
Say it again?
What about the Abraham Accords?
The Abraham Accords.
And what about that?
Yeah, well, nothing has happened. That's all I can say. Really, nothing has happened.
Okay.
I guess like Hamas attacking Palestine in the first place is what kicked off that.
Yes, it did.
So why did they attack in the first place?
That's a great question. And I don't know, because I wondered that same thing. I was participating, I was watching a conference just yesterday between some veteran Hanan Ashrawi, a veteran negotiator. She was involved in the negotiations for Oslo, and other leading Palestinian figures. A couple of academics in the US, and that came up, your question. And the answer was, that's the $500 million question. Because what it did is it destabilized the entire region. If that was, and some argue it was, if that was the objective, then it has happened. But those who have planned it, the leaders, have been killed. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, except would it become so destabilized and so horrible that finally the world would have to look at it with open eyes. I think that's a horrible way to think about it, but I don't have an answer to that, except what I just said. I don't know. And not only that, the other question, why did the Israeli Defense Forces take so long to respond? And that question has not been probed completely in Israel as long as the Netanyahu government exists. And some argue the longer the war goes on, of course, Netanyahu's government will do his best to destroy not only Hamas, what he said he will do now, but that he will so destabilize the region that more will flee the area, which will then less Palestinians in the area, create more arguments for them going into Gaza and taking over. Now, that's a loaded issue.
So, over the past year, I forget what it was, the U.S. maybe ended up showing up in the Black Sea or somewhere around, I forget what sea exactly.
You mean the Yemeni down on Yemen? Yeah, that's the Yemen Civil War, and yeah.
Yeah, so they are there currently in case Iran does escalate the war a lot more. Do you think that's going to end up creating a new, kind of like a new Gulf War?
Well, remember, the U.S. has military forces all over the world. We have bases, we have the Navy. You would be surprised at where we have troops, where we have stationed military assets. So should something happen with Iran, honestly, you don't want anything to happen to further regionalize it.
Yeah, I know, but they also said that they were going to be there in case Iran does fire on them to help Israel out with intercepting missiles or giving support. That's what
Sure.
Become like that.
Sure, I mean, but already the Israelis and the Iranians have been lobbing missiles back and forth. And the Israelis, took out the research nuclear power plant station. So they've been going back and forth. Yes,
There's one from online.
yes. Yes, online.
What is our responsibility to stop the genocide being conducted by the Israeli state and found to be so under international law? And our, meaning all of us, per the Nuremberg principles.
So that's a great question. The U.S. has, in my personal opinion, and from what I know as an academic, we have failed in our sort of moral mission. We have stood by, and I have, just to make the point a little bit, click.
Go ahead.
So in Jenin, in one of the cities that is about 25,000 people in the West Bank, that the Israeli army recently went in and blew up about a bunch of houses, including this woman's home. And this was on NPR, the West Bank raids. And she says, who will listen to us? There's no side that I can address this complaint to about what's just happened in Israel. Look at Gaza. Look at the destruction. Who's listening to them? Why would someone listen to us? So to answer the question, who is listening? And if the United States were the honest broker, would it do more? Should it have done more? Categorically, yes, it should have done more to stop, which is tantamount to a genocide. It's tantamount to the destruction. When you murder 43,000 people within a year as vengeance for the 1,200 people who were killed, is that the scales of justice? Or is it something completely different than that? And so should the U.S. have played a role? It's easy for me to say here, but I can say with my moral compass that not just the U.S., but Russia and France and Germany and should have played a greater role as well. If we are supporting the Ukraine, then why are we not supporting the cause for peace in Palestine? So, yeah. Yes, sir, you have a hand up.
You talk about the U.S. stepping up. The question is at what point do we have a right to sacrifice American lives for a country that doesn't want us there in the first place?
Oh, sorry, we finished?
Yeah.
So, again, I didn't say we should, send in the Rangers, but there are other ways. One is you stop the shipment of arms. You put pressure on, just like in Ukraine, there are no U.S. boots on the ground. Well, I guess there's some for the weaponry that actually did go in, a small, but there's no one fighting. And so no one's arguing for that kind of intervention. But certainly stopping, and I mean, look, if the great powers today said to the Israelis, you have to stop, we're cutting off all aid. That's a powerful tool. And if someone said to the Palestinians the same thing, that's a powerful tool. That tool has never been used. That's all. Never been used. Yeah, Paul.
So that being the moral way of solving.
Right.
But what do you think about the signal of the new administration?
Say it again?
What do you think about the signal that the new administration is sending by appointing Mike Huckabee as ambassador?
Yeah. I think that it's a very precarious signal. Yeah, I don't know. We have to see what happens.
So we can't really hope for a moral resolution.
So Walter Benjamin was a philosopher of the 1920s who said in 1925, those without, it is, something to the effect of, those without hope have only hope to consider. And so I'm paraphrasing it. It is so let's have hope. That's all I can say. We'll see what unfolds. I'm not optimistic, but I'm trying to be. At the same time, you could argue that in the last Trump administration, they attempted to take a pragmatic view on some things. But on other things, they took a blind eye. And the pronouncements of the president-elect have been in support of Netanyahu. And so that doesn't look like let's look at this and see what the issues are. Because frankly, it's easy to be completely clouded by the longevity of this conflict and the need for resolution by looking at the rights of the Palestinians and the Israelis. Because you just can't say to the Israelis, okay, you all pack it up and go back to Europe. They're there. They're going to stay. They're not moving. Likewise, the Palestinians are there. Ignoring them and saying they don't exist and allowing the misery of the territories to continue and being essentially, when Jimmy Carter wrote a book and referred to the military occupation of West Bank and Gaza and the military control by the Israeli as the equivalent of apartheid and the homelands in South Africa, he got a lot of flack, but he was correct. And that's what it's become. And so we can't turn a blind eye to that. But it's easy to say, oh, that doesn't exist. Not an issue. It's only the Israeli point of view. But it's not. Remember at the beginning context? It's multiple points of view. And right now, the Palestinians are essentially locked in, and they have to go through military checkpoints the minute they go out, and they are harassed in the West Bank, and it's not a way to live. And until you have sovereignty for the Palestinians, this conflict and this insecurity will continue, in my view. So I'm not optimistic, but then who knows what will happen with the new administration. All I can do is look historically and how it informs us. And historically, if we've learned anything, you can't ignore the rights of one people and expect there to be peace. You just can't. And you can't ignore the suffering. And you can't ignore the fact that they were using food at one point in Gaza as a weapon, which violates, someone mentioned the Nuremberg laws, violates all international law. So there have been a lot of international laws violated by the Israelis and that the West has been complicit to, but we don't talk about that.
So
Why?
that's a great lead into the next question, which
Oh.
says, we started with talking about empathy.
Right.
What are your thoughts on the education of empathy, and how can we implement the practice and cultivation of empathy on a worldwide scale?
I'd start with local, right? But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, whoever asked it. We need to teach history. All right? We need to teach history. We need to teach how to be empathetic. How can we be empathetic if we don't know the history? So if you don't know anything of the history of the Palestinians and of the region and of the Israelis, you can just say, oh, the Israelis are fighting for survival because that was a horrible attack on October 7th that it was. But it's so much more than that. But how do we be empathetic if we're not taught the history? We don't require history.
People are ignorant.
And then sometimes we require it, and then people who shouldn't be teaching it, are teaching it. That's another story. Go ahead. Oh, you haven't asked the question. You have. Go ahead.
So you saw everyone, like about Ukraine, how they stood up, and everyone up in their countries. Why do you think our people one cares about.
Because I think of inherent racism in our society. And no one, I know we're not supposed to talk now because there's no racism, of course. Well, that's so much garbage. And that it's because of racism in this society. It's because of the anti-Arab, honestly, there's an anti-Arab bias. There has been. And I think it lies in that. And again, I don't know how to probe it further, but there is that bias. It's, you know, it comes up whenever we're talking about the Palestinian issue. Or whenever we're talking about, it's as if that those rights are less than. And I have to say, one, lack of knowledge. If it's not racism, it's a lack of knowledge. And those usually go together, by the way. They really do. In many ways, you could argue. I don't know if that answers your question. But I think that's part of it. I mean, you know, look, I remember back at 9/11. People were being harassed if they had turbans, who were Sikhs from India. So the racism, the anti-Arab bias was so thick, people didn't, you're all the same.
Yeah, they destroyed 2 countries.
Yes,
because of that.
that's right.
Down in Iraq.
Which was, again, where's the justice? There is none. Iraq hasn't recovered. Again, another discussion, right? Yeah. Yes, you had.
I just wondering what can be done with empathy?
Speak a little louder.
What can be done with empathy when the paradox of tolerance is at play? When, if we're empathetic, as I guess what I'm seeing is that Israel doesn't want, there's no.
Oh, well, it's one thing for
Maybe
us,
trying to
I think so.
help
It's
people.
one thing for us to learn how to be empathetic,
Yeah.
to learn how to put ourselves into the shoes of someone else. In terms of the Israeli government's position on negotiations and peace, that's a much more complicated topic. And we really do need to call for pizza and have a couple more hours. Right? Because why is it that they cling to the right to settle in the West Bank? Well, it has everything to do with their nationalist beliefs tied to a religious worldview. And that wasn't always the case. You know, Zionism has a very secular framework, and the early Israeli state was very secular. That has been changing in Israel itself with the right-wing resurgence the past 20 years. Are there any other questions from home or from Zoom land?
No more on Zoom land. Just a lot of thank yous, and they'd love to hear more from you.
Oh, see, someone wants to hear more from me. Imagine that. I can tell my family that. Well, listen, it has been great to be here with you today, and I hope your curiosity has been sort of sparked, and I wish you all well, and go forward and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.